Welcome to this explainer. The summer of 1665, it was literally the hottest summer anyone in London could remember. The Thames River actually shrank between its banks, exposing these baking mudflats right to the sun. Today, we're going to explore a moment when civilization just stopped. And to truly grasp the horror of this sweltering summer, we've got to start with a terrifying micro-story of a woman named Margaret Pontius. Margaret lived just outside London's ancient walls in a parish called St. Giles in the Fields. Now, first came the fever, right? Then a splitting headache, and within just hours, a soft swelling in her armpit. An elderly parish worker, they called them searchers of the dead, examined the body and wrote just one single word in her ledger: plague. And the exact moment that word was recorded, on April 12th, Margaret's house literally became a tomb. By law, the authorities locked the door from the outside. So Margaret's husband, her children, they were trapped inside with her corpse for 40 agonizing days, completely guarded by an armed watchman. The chilling phrase, "Lord have mercy upon us," was painted in red right above their sealed door. It thrusts us into a kind of psychological horror that is honestly almost impossible to imagine today. Picture it: entire families imprisoned in cramped, boiling hot rooms with their dying relatives and putrefying corpses. By September of that year, 7,000 Londoners were dying every single week. Section 1. A city ripe for disaster. Before we witness the total breakdown of society here, we really need to understand why London, this booming maritime empire, was essentially a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off. 1665 London was a complete sensory nightmare. Just imagine 500,000 people crammed into a walled city barely 2 miles across. The streets were deliberately narrow, with the upper stories of timber-framed houses jutting out to create these shaded tunnels where the sun literally never reached. And down the center of these cobblestone lanes, open drains carrying animal waste and kitchen slops directly toward the Thames. It was incredibly overcrowded, deafeningly loud, and foul-smelling. Honestly, it was the absolute perfect breeding ground for disease.
Yep. There was a really brutal divide in the city. On one side, you had wealthy merchants living in spacious stone houses near the Royal Exchange. But on the other hand, the desperately poor were crammed into single rooms in the sprawling, tangled suburbs they called the Liberties. This stark contrast in living conditions, well, it would absolutely dictate exactly who lived and who died during the outbreak.
Let's move on to Section 2, the 40-day death sentence. We're going to track how the plague crept in silently among those very poor neighborhoods before causing total citywide panic. You see, the plague didn't announce itself with trumpets. Actually, it was more of a slow burn at first. The parish clerks compiled these weekly lists called the Bills of Mortality, and they reveal a terrifying exponential escalation. 9 deaths, then 14. At first, the wealthy paid absolutely no attention because everyone just sort of assumed the plague was a disease of the poor. But then it jumped to 43. And by late June, over 200 plague deaths were recorded in a single week. The danger was spreading like wildfire through dry timber, and the rich finally realized, uh-oh, we are no longer safe. Survival quickly became purely a matter of wealth. The exodus from the city was massive. King Charles II abandoned the city, followed by the aristocracy, the lawyers, and almost the entire College of Physicians. Get this, out of 79 licensed doctors, only 3 stayed behind. 3. But what about the poor? They were completely trapped. A seat on a wagon out of town cost 5 shillings, which was way more than a laborer earned an entire week. And hey, even if they had the money, surrounding villages posted armed men to block Londoners from entering anyway. So the really crucial point here is what happened to the people left behind. The authorities enforced this absolutely draconian policy, the 40-day quarantine. Now, the brutal logic was to isolate the sick to save the healthy, right? Makes sense on paper. But in practice, it meant sentencing completely healthy family members to a horrific death, locked in a sweltering tenement alongside rotting corpses, with an armed watchman making sure no one got out. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys actually recorded the shrieks of women and children coming from these locked houses. He said it was a sound that could pierce the stoutest heart. Which brings us to Section 3, desperation and urban collapse. As the disease spread wildly through the summer, the basic mechanisms of civilization simply stopped functioning. The physical and social landscape of London transformed completely. People literally walked down the dead center of lanes just to avoid the walls. They refused to shake hands. Normal courtesies, completely gone. The whole sensory experience shifted to this oppressive silence, broken only by the constant monotonous tolling of church bells for the dead. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke from street corner bonfires of pitch and sulfur that were meant to, quote, cleanse the air. And at night, the dead carts roamed the streets by torchlight, with drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead," hauling bodies to these massive 40-foot plague pits dug deep into the London clay and moorfields.
Section 4, Peak Horror and Quack Cures. So by autumn, the death toll was defying all comprehension. And this led to a rapid rise of dark, bizarre religious fervor and the complete breakdown of medicine. Remember, almost all the medical professionals had fled. Desperate Londoners turned to a grotesque carnival of quack cures. People actually wore amulets made from dried toad carcasses to draw out the poison. Or, and seriously, you cannot make this up, they literally held warm chickens or pigeons against their plague swellings. Quacks hawked useless nostrums made of garlic, vinegar, and viper flesh. And for the poor, there was hellebore, a highly toxic plant meant to induce violent vomiting and sweating. It was just pure, unadulterated desperation. Look, in a world without germ theory, the plague could really only be understood as divine judgment. Enter figures like Solomon Eccles. He was a Quaker who walked the streets stark naked except for a loincloth, carrying a pan of burning sulfur on his head. He screamed, "Repent! Repent!" through the terrifying silence of the city, warning everyone that God was punishing London's moral laxity. And to a terrified population with literally no medical hope, his apocalyptic prophecies, they felt like absolute truth.
Section 5, Fire, Rebuilding, and Legacy. The outbreak peaked in September, bringing astronomical death tolls before the cooling autumn weather finally began to slow the spread of the fleas that were actually carrying the disease. When the surviving population finally emerged to count the cost, the devastation was vastly worse than official records let on. While the parish clerks recorded roughly 68,000 dead, modern demographic analysis suggests the true death toll exceeded 100,000. To put that into perspective, that was nearly 20% of London's entire population wiped out in a single summer. Entire lineages, families, and trades were completely erased from the map. Now, this brings us to a massive historical myth. We often hear that the Great Fire of London the very next year, in 1666, burns the plague away, right? Well, that is factually incorrect. The plague was actually already subsiding naturally due to cold weather and population immunity. And get this, even more telling, the hardest-hit slum parishes where the plague truly thrived, places like Whitechapel and Clerkenwell, didn't even burn in the fire. However, the fire did lead to a permanent, accidental cure for the plague. The massive rebuilding acts passed by Parliament were strictly designed for fire safety, but look at what they actually did. They mandated brick and stone construction, they banned thatched roofs entirely, they abolished those jutting dark timber tunnels, and they widened the streets for better air circulation. So totally without realizing it, by eliminating the timber and thatch, London destroyed the very nesting sites the plague-carrying rats relied on. They accidentally built a city where the plague could no longer gain a foothold. Pretty wild, right? The Great Plague of 1665 was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Britain, but it leaves us with a terrifying blueprint of what happens when the mechanisms of civilization just fail. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. As we look at our own sprawling, modern cities, if the basic functions of our society suddenly ground to a halt tomorrow, what modern disasters are quietly laying the groundwork for our future survival? And maybe more importantly, when the doors lock, who gets left behind? Thank you so much for exploring with us. Keep questioning the history around you, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.